All right, welcome everyone. Hopefully you know where you are, but you have made it to the session, How Open Is It? I'm Eric Christiansen, an assistant professor and librarian from Mount Royal University in Calgary, and Michael McNally, associate professor, School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Alberta, Edmonton, will be our hosts of this game show sounding title, and we are very excited that you're all here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dustin. And as we begin with Eric located in Calgary, he's on Treaty 7 territory, and that's Métis Region 3, and I'm on Treaty 6 territory, which is Métis Region 4. And of course, we're both in Alberta, which is home to a diverse range of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And while our work today doesn't focus on the intersection between Indigenous knowledges and cultural expression and open practices and content, I think it's important to consider how open education and open educational resources can be made useful to all peoples and cultures. And we will touch a little bit on the idea of what role cultural considerations can play in openness. And so, Eric, if you want to move along on the first slide. So this presentation, and I will, there's only about 20 of us, so feel free to jump in with questions in the chat, and I will be looking at the chat. And we've got a couple questions as well. But this work builds on some earlier work that we did, and I'm sharing the link there for the First Monday article, which was an article we wrote last year called Open Enough, 8 Factors to Consider When Transitioning from closed to open resources and courses. And this work came out of discussions that Eric and I had over a couple of years, really. And we're both involved in creating different open materials. And we were discussing, it's not just an open license, but it's actually, ultimately we settled on these 8 factors that influence openness. And we found that none of them are a simple dichotomy. All of them exist on a spectrum from closed to most open. And in that paper, some of the other things we did is not only discuss the relationship among the factors, we looked at the role of effort and willingness in those. So some of the factors really don't require much effort or willingness, but those two aren't always necessarily the same. And then as well, we looked at the skill and knowledge required, and we found that for some things like languages, for example, designing resources in multiple languages takes a lot of effort, willingness, and skill. And in other cases, using a more open license like a CC BY license really is quite a low bar. And so we made some suggestions in that paper in terms of how we might think about maximizing openness, or where we wouldn't want to put in too much effort and maximize openness. But that led us to, and Eric, if you want to move it on, to thinking about frameworks and conceptual frameworks. So, why do we need to think about understanding OpenCourseWare and open educational resources? And I should note as well, we consider OpenCourseWare, even though the literature in many ways has moved on, but OpenCourseWare is still a broader range of kind of work that has to be integrated together. And I think now that we've focused on resources as an OER community for over a decade now, and certainly the MOOC movement displaced some of the emphasis on OCW, but perhaps we will start to return to thinking more about integrating series of resources back into courses. So in terms of thinking about openness from a conceptual framework, we wanted to think about, in future work and the subject of today's presentation, what can we do well? Where are we already seeing a lot of strength and openness, and what can we improve? And, what are the kind of potential lingering concerns? And a lot of this work is driven by trying to encourage those who are new to OER to think about where they might best put their time and effort. So for those of you in the audience, and I'll paste the questions in the chat, do you currently use frameworks or guidelines to evaluate OER? And in particular, is openness something that the framework considers, as opposed to the focus purely on quality? And if so, which frameworks do you use?
Also, to answer Kurt's question, the slides are available online. We posted them on the page for this presentation, and we'll probably share them more broadly after as well. Maybe, Michael, we can get an open link for those slides at some point.
Yeah. Oh, and so thank you, Nathan. Nathan notes they've got a modified version of the open textbook evaluation from BC Campus. So that's of course, BC Campus has done a lot of good work, but doesn't focus on openness in particular. And Eric, maybe if you want to go ahead to the next slide, and I'll start talking about what might be part of the reason why there's doesn't tend to be a huge focus on openness. Just in terms of some of the background work, part of our Eric and I's discussion, and certainly front and center. And Michelle, of course, also pointing to the same rubric from BC Campus. So part of the thinking that has influenced Eric and I in particular is Pomerantz and Peake's 50 Shades of Open, which is really a great article sketching out all the different ways open is used and in some cases abused, for everything from open source software, open education, all the way to open source beer. And they've characterized many of the different approaches to openness. There are several others, and of course this is by no means an exhaustive list, but Hodgkinson and Williams and Gary have the 4 facets of openness, so social, technical, legal, and financial. And rather like ours, they posit all of these as being spectrums of openness. I think Peter and Diamond have a really interesting piece contrasting phases of openness historically, and noting that rather than looking at openness in relation to open education and open educational resources, they highlight that education has become more and less open over centuries. As well, there's a couple of other, scholarly approaches to conceiving of openness. But in terms of evaluative frameworks, the literature really is quite thin. There is the ALMS framework from 2010, and it focuses on access to editing tools, levels of expertise, whether the material is meaningfully editable, and source file access. And notably, Gorel, in their doctoral thesis, took that ALMS framework and created a scoring framework for us for that. And that's kind of what we're kind of looking at doing now. And as well, Abba-Wardena has created a desirability index, but by and large, we tend to see rubrics focused on quality and not necessarily on openness. So in terms of our research questions, we took that framework that we developed, and we are now trying to determine whether those 8 factors are robust enough to assess OpenCourseWare, and to what degree are the factors kind of usable in this regard? Are they too complicated or impractical for measurement? So what we did is we went to looked at major open course offerings. And of course, many institutions that had OpenCourseWare initiatives from 2008 through to 2012 don't do anything anymore. So a lot of what we found was quite dated. But TU Delft and MIT still had very current OpenCourseWare offerings. Of course, MIT going back all the way to 2001. But we found these 2 institutions had current courses. So last 5 years, they were still practicing OpenCourseWare. And so we then selected 5 courses randomly from each institution, and we applied those 8 factor framework to look at those 10 courses. This is a small pilot study. One of the things we found is that it's very time intensive to go through a whole course of material and substantively look at it through 8 different lenses. Although we did find in some cases, some of those open courses were pretty thin. So we got a highlight here in terms of the results, and then Eric will talk you through these more detail and some of the thinking that's come out of this analysis. So as you can see, there were different factors that were done quite well. For example, the digital distribution factor, were files easily available and readily available on major open education platforms, and all of the courses did well there. In other cases, File format, for example, was one where things were done very poorly. Things weren't very open in terms of file format. And some of the other factors were rather mixed. And one thing that's important to note too, across all of these findings is that in some cases, these were individual instructor decisions. So instructors would create assessment mechanisms. They might choose to use closed questions that are very open because you can give out an answer key, or they might choose to adjust materials in other languages. In some cases, like copyright license, that was institutionally determined. Both MIT and TU Delft tell the instructors what they have to do. So Eric will walk us through the findings in a bit more detail.
So thank you, everybody. So I just want to emphasize that the goal of this project wasn't to make huge or broad generalizations about the quality or detail or openness of OpenCourseWare, though we do have a few hypotheses at the end of this paper. It's really to test the framework. So the big question is, does the framework actually work? And we think it does. We actually, Michael and I feel like it's a fairly robust framework, and we haven't shown you the details of what closed, mixed, and most open mean in the framework. We'll show that at the end because we've done a revision of what we've originally designed from our first paper. But it does work, but there are some caveats. So for instance, some things are just too subjective to analyze. We went into this developing a conceptual framework, thinking that looking at cultural considerations and usability would be fairly straightforward because both of us have quite a bit of experience thinking in OER in those terms. I used to do usability research, but we ultimately came to the conclusion that those are too subjective measures for us to go through. We couldn't come up with a reliable reconciliation in terms of what we thought the courses should land on. So we've adjusted the framework as need be. And we also ended up adjusting the language of the framework for some of these individual factors. So digital distribution, we really clarified it. It was how easily could you find the courses that we were testing. So we changed that to something that's a bit more understandable, which is discoverability. Accessibility and usability, because we wanted to remove the usability aspect due to its subjectivity, we just changed that factor to accessibility. So the basics, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a bit. And then support costs, we changed to materials, mostly wording changes to make things a bit more straightforward. So at a very high level, the factors, as you could see from that overview diagram that we're going to put in our paper, are as follows. So copyright was generally mixed. This is an example of something that's typically done, or at least in the case of MIT and TU Delft, institutional decisions. These are CC by non-commercial Creative Commons licenses. So we classify licenses that are open but have some restrictions, like non-commercial share alike. We consider those mixed because while they are technically open for other people to use, it makes it more challenging to combine resources. And both these institutions employed a kind of a middle of the road license. In terms of accessibility, this was either very open or very closed. So Michael and I did not go through every piece of video and find out to see if they had an exact transcript. We didn't use accessibility checkers on the web to make sure that all the HTML was verified. What we really looked for was to see if the institutions tried to adhere to a recognizable accessibility web standard. And in the case of MIT, they absolutely do. And in fact, they have a fairly detailed page on the accessibility standards that they adhere to, where TU Delft, on the other hand, didn't do that at all. We also noticed that when analyzing the MIT courses, particularly if you download the entire course as a file and harvest it, which I'll get to in a bit, that they always included things like the closed captions, transcripts for videos, where some access to that material for those who are perhaps hearing or impaired was a little bit more spotty on the TU Delft side. In terms of assessment, those were generally mixed. And we meant that mixed or halfway open, being that most of the courses had assessments available. So they had a full syllabus, they had learning outcomes, and they had assessments available. But we didn't classify assessment as most open. We considered it mixed because, and this is largely due to the kinds of courses we looked at, because we consider a fully open course would have both the assessments as well as the answers available and potentially the ability for the learner to self-assess. And we talk about that in a lot more detail in our first paper. And in terms of discoverability, all of these courses were very open, which is not surprising given that it's MIT and TU Delft, kind of some of the leaders in terms of OpenCourseWare. But we think this is actually a huge success for OpenCourseWare and OER, because for a long time, one of the sticking points among faculty and educators was findability. So the fact that all of these courses were available through the major federated searches for open educational resources, MOOCs, OpenCourseWare, is very good. Now, in terms of factors that tended to be more closed, this was perhaps where things were a bit more surprising. So in terms of materials, the vast majority of materials were closed, meaning that there were still paid textbooks were kind of the backbone of these courses. If there were academic articles, they were typically available presumably through the library, but they were not open access articles. And many of the courses, particularly those in MIT, had direct Amazon purchase links for the textbooks, meaning that there was not a huge amount of effort put into open readings. And now we determined that halfway open or mixed in terms of materials would probably be access to resources that are licensed through the library, but not a paid textbook. So that would be kind of the halfway point. And we were surprised to find that so many of the OpenCourseWare courses still really depended on a textbook. There was a few notable exceptions. One TU Delft course, for example, public hygiene and epidemiology had a custom open textbook and complete reading. So it was really the high bar in terms of open materials. File format was one of the most surprising findings from this pilot study. Overwhelmingly closed, absolutely non-editable PDF documents, both downloaded at the individual level and if one tried to download the entire course and harvest it in its entirety. This was very surprising to us because an absolute critical factor of open education outside licensing is the ability to adapt and revise for different contexts and purposes. And in this case, nobody would be able to do that without either Adobe Acrobat to edit PDFs or to retype or copy and paste the material. So we were really quite shocked by that. We also found that language and cultural considerations were closed, which was not surprising. All English, predominantly English courses, which is consistent with the open educational resources that are developed worldwide generally are English. Some exceptions for TU Delft because there were Dutch materials available. And then for cultural considerations, this was either quite open, or mixed, because that leaned towards the types of courses we looked at. Of course, MIT and TU Delft are more technical institutes. And while we removed cultural considerations from the end framework, ultimately, we found that these courses were quite open because they weren't culturally specific. And this is likely that STEM courses will probably always have an advantage in terms of being more open culturally because the examples tend to cross cultural barriers a little bit easier. So we had a few lingering questions left over from this study. First is that there's always a question about openness in terms of audio video file formats. And this is something we kind of hypothesized about in our previous paper, meaning that should file format openness address just the type of file format, so commonly available editable formats, or should it also take into account the editability? So are the raw uneditable files of video and audio available? Because of course something's a little bit less editable if you've been presented with a polished video or a lecture. It's a little bit harder to chop up. So there's still some questions about how one would evaluate the openness of more AV formats. There's also a question about harvestability. MIT, for example, gives the user the ability to download an entire course, which is super handy, which includes everything in it except the large video files. So you can go back and download the videos individually, but they don't come as part of the zip file when you're harvesting an online course if you want to base your course on this. We think harvestability is probably an area of future consideration because it's critical for areas that have limited bandwidth and need to work offline. Ultimately, we ended up coming up with a revised framework. So this should make a little bit more sense. This is very similar to the framework we proposed in our papers. We have the 8 factors along the left-hand side, and then we have kind of 3 hypothetical scenarios of what those factors would look like under a closed, mixed, and most open. And what we found is that these factors could probably be better divisible or divided into both technical factors and pedagogical factors. And if you look at this system that we have, you can see how we divided things like assessment, as I was talking about. So assessment in its most open form would be not only publicly available assessments and learning outcomes, but the ability to self-assess, so not require an instructor. Something like language could be bilingual or guides for steps to translation in a mixed scenario, and then say a multilingual course would be the most open, the most culturally specific. At the bottom of the framework, we've also moved other considerations which are non-measurable, things like cultural and usability. So at this point, we wanted to ask our second question, which is that based on the framework that we're coming up with here, which factors do you feel are missing from this? I think that's the question that we settled on, right, Michael? What are the missing factors, if any, that you feel should be added to this framework? And we have a question from, oh, that's Michael. So we could think about dividing these factors into additional subsets, maybe totally different factors. I mentioned harvestability as one, the ability to grab a course in its entirety versus downloading individual aspects of the course in a piecemeal fashion. Are there other things that people think are missing or that are critical to this framework?
I feel like there could be something in there for understanding what platforms people are using. I know that's partially part of the discoverability, but are they in closed off LMSs, firewalls that even if they're licensed, what's the problem? But I know you get to some of that in file format, but it's almost like a question about LMSs to some extent.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there may be something that we can provide more description to for discoverability, because of course there's lots of courses that are open that have full access, but they're very low because they live within an LMS or they live within an institutional repository that's not connected to a federated search or something like that.
Exactly. And I think you touch on that in a couple of different places, but if that could be, I think that's very useful information for the community.
Yeah, that's something we could definitely flesh out. So this is super helpful. Michael, are we still doing our poll? Sorry.
Yeah, and Nathan has a good point, and other people have picked up on it on how does the material fit with learning objectives. And I want to highlight one of the courses we looked at was a course on art history, and I think it's notable in that I downloaded the whole course and I went through everything, and the course was just a list of paintings by week, and I could not find anything more than the list of paintings per week. And I sat there not knowing much about art history, thinking, I really have no idea what this course, I mean, there's a list of paintings, but I don't know what the theme of these paintings is. And so, yeah, that the richness and the quality of the educational material itself is not something that is considered within this framework as it relates to openness.
I'm also looking at time because I think, Dustin, we're pretty close to the end here. So I'll keep moving forward and wrap this up. But if people have more comments on the framework, please continue to put them in because we're monitoring that. So after this analysis, Michael and I have decided that what we're really trying to get to in terms of analyzing OpenCourseWare and OER is what we call looking below the iceberg. So the iceberg has become our analogy. We've adopted kind of the Maslow style system. And what we think and what we hypothesize is that you could really break openness, if you're looking at these factors and groups, into two broad domains. We have technical domains, so copyright, file format, discoverability, things like that. And we also have pedagogical domains. So that's kind of the below the iceberg. And the educator challenges for these technical domains historically has been the willingness to share. So in the early era of open education, the goal was to get people familiar with Web 2.0, to get things online, to build up these repositories, and that required a degree of skill and knowledge to share. And we cover skill and knowledge in our previous paper. But as we move into a more pedagogically focused domain, which are really critical for addressing educator concerns around quality and context, this comes with much more increased workload, associated developing ancillary materials, providing guidance and context for other educators. And this is the area where we feel that open education really has the most room to grow, and at least in the term, in the context of OpenCourseWare. And for this one, this is just a highlight here at the end, some things that we think could be majorly improved. So in the technical domain, obviously the file format, more editability, more choice. Things like language can easily be addressed with things like glossaries, and then material costs are something that really needs to be focused on in terms of the future of open education for context. And then for our future research, I'll leave this aside, a larger study that involves a larger sample of courses, more harvestability, and kind of better understanding of how instructors locate and adapt OpenCourseWare to their own context. So with that, that's a very quick wrap up of our presentation, and a big thank you to everybody who attended. And I don't know if we have any time for questions, but please drop them in the chat.
I would encourage each of you to write your emails in the chat real quick for those who can't grab screenshots necessarily in a traditional fashion. I want to thank everyone for being here today. It seems like Eric and Michael would not be mad if you reached out to them to discuss this further. So I would encourage everyone to do that. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to stop the recording now, and I'm just glad you all came in and heard this great presentation.